Welcome back to Proxima, everybody, and today we're going to be finally looking at the Craftworld Eldar Faction Focus that GW has very generously handed before us. And we're going to be basically looking at breaking down all of the different things that they've shown us in the video and talking about the good and, of course, the very bad. Now, I haven't looked at any other reviews or anything like that on YouTube or anywhere else about the Faction Focus whatsoever. So these opinions that I'm going to give you are going to be straight from my own mind. They're not going to be influenced at all by any other content creators on YouTube or any of, well, basically anything outside of what I've heard from my gaming group, either texting me or stuff like that. Now, I have heard a few comments on YouTube and I've seen a few comments here and there. But other than that, these are just going to be my unfiltered, unadulterated thoughts on the changes. So without further ado, let us go ahead and get right into it and look at what we're going to be overviewing today. We're going to be looking at the army ability, which is indeed Strands of Fate, which is what I predicted. We're going to be looking at the detachment rule, Unparalleled Foresight, which is something that I did not see coming. We're going to be looking at the Farseer datasheet, which I actually thought would be the Avatar datasheet, but I'm kind of glad that we know that Farseers, or where Farseers stand now as far as 10th edition. We're going to be overviewing the Guardian datasheet, the Fire Prism Cannon, and the key stratagem that GW has given us for our index. So right off the bat, the army rule is Strands of Fate, which is something I actually thought would be the case. I didn't see Strands of Fate not happening, seeing as there was a lot of dice manipulation army rules that were out there already. So basically, it does work differently, though. You roll 12 dice at the beginning of the game, and you can re-roll the results if you want, but roll one less dice each time. So essentially, you start with 12. If the roll really sucks, you can re-roll it as many times as you want until you get a roll that you want. However, you do have to take out one dice each time you do so. My advice for this is probably to roll it a couple times. If you don't get the result you want, you're shit out of luck. You might as well just keep it. I would probably stop at about 10 or 9 if you're just rolling bad one after the other, but you probably shouldn't roll that badly at least. And what's left of these dice become your fate dice that you can use for the rest of the battle. And you can basically use them throughout the battle to substitute for certain rolls. So if you roll 4 4s in that group of 12 dice, throughout the battle, if you ever needed a 4+ on something, you could use that dice instead. This works exactly like Miracle Dice do. So if any of you are familiar with the Sisters of Battle and how their dice works, this is basically now the same thing, a carbon copy. So here's my take on this. My take is that this is objectively worse over the course of a 5-turn game than what we have now. Not only are you no longer getting automatic 6s, but you're also losing about 8 dice over the course of the battle. Yes, you are getting them all together, but in the long run, you're going to lose about 8 dice worth of strands. And let's be honest, most of the cool stuff in the game happens on 6s, whether it be weapon special rules or unit abilities. Most likely, the other results, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, are all going to be either really bad or just not that great. Especially if your chances of doing that particular thing were pretty high anyway. For example, getting a 3 on a hit when you hit on 3+ isn't really that great, right? Yes, you're guaranteeing the roll, but it's not as good as a 6 and proccing a special ability off of it. Now, from what we've seen so far in the reveal, we also don't have as many of these abilities that proc on 6s as do other armies. So there is that. It just won't matter as much for Eldar. A hit on a 4 is the same thing as a hit on a 6 in most cases. But for other weapons in the codex, like maybe D cannons or D weapons, which probably will proc some kind of mortal wound when they roll a 6 to wound or 6 to hit, that will actually affect it. Now, this version of Strands of Fate, to be honest with you guys, straight up, is much worse than what we have now. However, it's not much worse when you compare it to the other faction abilities aside from Oath of Moment. So the Space Marine Oath of Moment is obviously the most OP thing we've seen so far. I'm just going to be honest with you guys. It is kind of a bullshit army ability, if I'm just being honest. Allowing your whole army to reroll wounds and hits against something is extremely problematic against certain matchups. And I'm not even talking about Eldar, right? I'm talking more like against things like Imperial Knights, Imperial Guard, they're using Bane Blades and things like that. I think it's going to be much harder for those units, those tough units, to survive against a Space Marine faction when built up correctly. And for that reason, I honestly don't really like Oath of Moment a whole lot. But if you look at the other faction reveals, Strands of Fate is honestly on kind of the top tier of what we've seen so far as far as army abilities, right? If you look at the Leagues of Votann army ability, right? The Grudge Token system, getting a +1 to hit or to wound against a target with a Grudge Token on it seems pretty good until you realize that there's a lot of counterplay to that, right? That unit has to kill a Votann unit to be able to get that Grudge Token. And there may be other ways to hand out Grudge Tokens, but it looks like Strands of Fate just happens and there's just not a lot your opponent can do about it, right? You roll your dice, you get that many miracle dice essentially. And there's not much your opponent can do because you can use these rolls however you like. With Sisters of Battle and their miracle dice, they have to have a unit destroyed, right? They have to lose an actual unit in their army to gain a miracle dice. And yes, they will have units that will generate miracle dice themselves, but so are the Eldar. So overall, I think Strands of Fate, obviously much worse than what we have now. In fact, I would even say garbage to what we have now in 9th edition, but it is much better than some of the other army abilities that we've seen from other factions, comparatively. And one last little thing about the Strands of Fate, you can use all of the dice at any time you want. So if you wanted to, you could use all 12 dice in the first turn. If you were trying to do some sort of crazy alpha strike or something like that, you could theoretically use all of them in a single turn. So if you wanted to do some kind of cloud striking falcon thing or wave serpent assault in turns 1 or 2, you could definitely do this and just blow all the dice on that. Sure, you absolutely could. But, would you want to? I don't know. It just depends on your list, right? So there is that. You do have some flexibility with it, unlike before, but it is much weaker in general to what we currently have. Now let's look at the detachment rule, which is unparalleled foresight. So it's not battle focus, guys. Unfortunately, it looks like we lost battle focus. Battle focus may just return on select units, fast units, maybe jet bike units or something like that we'll see it on, but I kind of doubt it. I think battle focus is for the most part going to go away. In general, you may see it on things like swooping hawks, maybe, but not on much else. You obviously will see it on warp spiders, but you won't see it on a vast majority of Eldar units. So what unparalleled foresight does is it's basically expert crafters from 8th edition. And everyone who remembers playing in 8th edition remembers this was the go-to army ability for Eldar. And why? Because Eldar have a lot of units that can be taken in singles, and this basically boosts them to the extreme. So each unit in the army gets to reroll a single hit dice and wound dice each time it shoots or fights. So guys, this is both the hit and the wound roll. So if I'm fielding a single Warwalker with 2 Bright Lances, I can reroll the hit roll, the wound roll, and if I have a Strands dice of a 6 or a 5 or something like that, I can use that on the damage roll too and boost my damage up to 7 or 8, which is pretty insane. If you think about 1 Bright Lance being able to take off 8 damage off of a vehicle, I mean, that's more than the Fire Prism does as of now. So I will go into the Fire Prism in a little bit, but that's a pretty good synergy. So we have a lot of units, obviously, in our army that can be taken as singles. We have Vipers, Warwalkers. We have things like, for example, a Bright Lance in a Guardian Squad, or a Wraith Lord that can take 2 heavy weapons as well. We have things like Wave Serpents, Falcons. We have a lot of access to single, high strength, and powerful weapons. Hell, if we wanted to, we could even take 3 single units of D-cannons, just 1 D-cannon apiece, and we could roll singles on that as well. Single roll to hit, single reroll to wound, right? And we could use our Strands dice accordingly depending on how good the D-cannon is. That's really fantastic. So even though this ability isn't battle focus, it's still very strong in its own right, and probably honestly the best that we've seen so far, especially on Craftworld Eldar. I think it synergizes very well with a lot of the stuff we can take. Okay, so here's my take on it overall. So this is pretty good, right? I think this is a very good ability, but it's not nearly as useful as battle focus for the vast majority of our units. So yes, it is going to help units like Wraith Lords, even Fire Prisms, right? Things like Warwalkers, single D cannons, those kind of things hit and wound very easily. with their anti-tank weapons. Their bright lances, their D cannons, they're going to be very effective. However, it's not going to be as useful for the units that are like dire vendors, right? Or like jet bikes, who really relied on that battle focus to stay behind obscuring terrain, oftentimes. So unfortunately, they're not going to get that anymore. Now, I suspect this is a return to a lot of the rerolls that will be lost from abilities like Guide and Doom as well. I think they're compensating for the fact that, hey, Eldar were the reroll faction, and now they're not going to have any more rerolls because Guide and Doom are gone, right? Or they're changed. So instead of basically just getting rid of all rerolls altogether, they said, well, let's just make it their army ability that basically every unit can reroll some dice. Which is fine, and I do suspect that we will see Guide and Doom being incorporated into the index as well, but they will not be rerolls anymore. I'm almost 100% sure now they're going to be a +1 to hit and a +1 to wound, and that's it. So you may see that on the Farseer Skyrunner or on Eldrad exclusively, which I almost guarantee you probably will see that on those specific units. So again, that's going to be getting rid of basically all the rerolls. It's still going to be good, but it's not going to be an auto-include like it once was in days past. And lastly, like I said before, this is really going to highly incentivize single units over larger ones with more attacks. So you're going to see a lot more Warwalkers, single Warwalkers out there. You're going to see a lot more single Vipers out there, single D cannons. You're going to see a lot more of those than you will anything else, any big, massive unit of, Warwalkers or Vipers, etc. Okay, so moving on to the Farseer. The Farseer's stats pretty much look almost the same. It does have one less wound, so it's even squishier than before. And now it only has Objective Control 1, which I found really odd because most characters that we've seen so far at least have Objective Control 2, as far as I've seen. So that means the Farseer will not be contributing to the amount of objective control that, an objective can have. So that's a little bit of a shame. I was expecting the Farseer to have a little bit more objective control than that, but, that's not the case. Eldritch Storm, as far as his shooting attack, it looks okay with the blast keyword. It's D6 blast, strength 6, AP -2, damage 2. So it has a decent strength and AP. The problem is you're probably not going to be using it all that much. Because like most things in the Eldar army, you're not going to want to reveal your Farseer and put him in a vulnerable position. And unfortunately, Eldritch Storm just doesn't quite have the range to put it into the range of safe to use and not get shot back, especially when you don't have battle focus. So it's, Eldritch Storm is okay, but it's just not the best. He still has a 4+ invul save, so obviously those rumors of a 5+ invul save were garbage and BS. And his combat ability is just as awful as it's always been, except now it's kind of worse because the Singing Spear no longer wounds on 2+. Yes, you heard me correctly. The Singing Spear, as it looks now, does not have the anti-infantry 2+ ability, so it's not going to be able to wound things on 2+, which means the Singing Spear is essentially, on a foot Farseer, completely useless. You can throw it. It's a strength 9, damage 3, no AP weapon, but it's just not worth taking, especially if it's extra points. So personally, all my Farseers are going to now have Witchblades. Now, Witchblades always wound on 2+, but they only wound infantry on 2+. So a former subscriber who, may have mentioned this on my channel at one point was right. They're not going to be able to wound vehicles on 2+ as well. It does also have -1 AP, and it has 2 damage. So it's not bad. It's just not great either. Now, here's really why you want to take the Farseer. It's because of his special ability. So Branching Fates allows you to change a fate dice to a 6 on a unit within 12 inches once per turn. And it looks like, based on the wording, you can only do this once, no matter how many Farseers you have. But, I could be wrong on that, but it seems like, based on the wording, that's what it is. And then, of course, he also has Fortune, so it works on a 2+. It allows you to target a unit within 12 inches, and that unit is going to get -1 to wound against attacks targeting it. Which, is decent. It's not as good as the old Fortune, but it's much easier to get off, so there is a trade-off there. It does also allow you to target a unit within 12. So what this means is that we are going to get a guide at some point with, the next couple of data sheets that we see in the index. So the Farseer Skyrunner, or perhaps even Eldrad, will be able to use guide in some form, I suspect, which will be a +1 to hit on a unit within 12 inches, which is good. It's not as good as full rerolls, but seeing as our detachment ability is going to be rerolls to wound and hit, it's not going to feel that bad. And Doom is probably going to be a +1 to wound, so same thing there. So, Farseers, Branching Fates can basically manipulate a Strands dice from something really low, like a 1. By the way, you're going to want to use this on 1s to get rid of your 1 rolls throughout the battle. Change them to 6s. And the Fortune is pretty good as well. It gives the unit more durability, especially on higher toughness units like Wraiths. Okay, so here's my take on this. The new Farseer is obviously much worse than the old one, as we had all suspected. However, it does have a few good synergies with Wraith units, especially Wraith Lords with Bright Lances. You know, that really comes to mind with the attachment ability. So basically, you can use the Farseer to change one of your Strands dice to a 6 on the damage, and with the Wraith Lord's Bright Lances, you're also re-rolling a hit roll and a wound roll, which is going to be really good. I think the Sniper variant of the Wraith Lord, where you have 2 Bright Lances on him, is going to be extremely effective. However, he doesn't add much to the unit he's with in terms of leadership or objective control. So I failed to mention this earlier, but he also does only have leadership 6+, just like the Guardians, which I will go into in a second. So he doesn't add much in terms of leadership to the unit. And most likely he's going to be parked out of line of sight and less with Wraiths, so won't be using Eldritch Storm very often. But he is pretty good at manipulating Fate Dice, and Fate Dice are going to be a mechanic that is going to be very useful for the Eldar, making sure that you can kill enemy units so that they can't fire back. And this is going to be good for that, making sure that you have Fate Dice throughout the battle. Okay, moving on to Guardians. Basically, this is something we knew was going to be revealed, right? Now, Guardians, their stats remain largely unchanged, except for the Objective Control 2 and the Leadership 6+, which is on Space Marine level now. So Eldar are actually quite a bit better at surviving against a leadership than I thought. I thought they were going to be leadership 7 guaranteed, but apparently GW decided that they're Space Marines as far as they can tell when it comes to leadership. So, hey, I guess that's a little bit of a plus. This means that they're going to hold objectives a little bit better and not be battle shocked. And on top of that, they still hit on 3+ across the board, even on the heavy weapon platform. And now, since moving and shooting with heavy weapons no longer incurs a -1 penalty, finally, the heavy weapon platform is fixed. It is working as intended. You can move with it and you can shoot with it. Great. That's how it always should have been. And it doesn't suffer a penalty for doing so. As for the weapons of the unit, basically, they all change. Now, first and foremost, the Shuriken Catapult, I just want to say this right off the bat, is nerfed. There's no more Shuriken roll, and there's no more sustained attacks. It's only getting AP1, or -1, I should say, and it's also getting the Assault rule, which we all know just means that you can move, advance, and shoot without penalty. Basically, that's the same thing we have now. So in terms of damage, Shuriken Catapult, nerfed to the ground. As far as the Eldar Missile Launcher, it looks pretty decent as a middle ground option, but probably still not better than the Bright Lancer Scatter Laser. Strength 10, AP -2 is good on the Star Shot, but it's not that good. So, and D6 damage again is decent, but it's not as good as the Bright Lance as far as taking out tanks go, and its anti-infantry option is honestly not that great. The Star Cannon looks pretty good now with Strength 8, so it's going to be wounding Toughness 4 on 2+, and it's going to be killing a Marine with every single shot, and it has AP -3, which is a very good AP value for this edition. So I do think the Star Cannon is going to be a contender for a heavy weapon for sure. Shuriken Cannons basically look the same as before. They do have Sustained 1, so that's good, but they lost basically their Shuriken ability, so their AP is not nearly as high. Even so, I would assume that units that can take Shuriken Cannons are still going to be good because of that Sustained Hits 1, but they're just not going to be as good as, what we thought it was going to be. The Bright Lance is looking really great. It's Strength 12, which is the same as the last cannon. It's AP -3, again, same as the last cannon, didn't see that coming. And it has D6 +2 damage, which is absolutely fantastic, especially with Strands dice, because you can use 6s to boost that D6 up to a 6. And with full rerolls with the army, with every unit, you can reroll a hit dice and a wound dice. You can be sure that Bright Lances are going to be a very popular option in 10th edition. I think we are seeing the rise of the Bright Lance, everybody. And lastly, the Scatter Laser has been nerfed to Strength 5. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. So I kind of understand why they did that, but with the increase in toughness on basically everything, I'm kind of disappointed. It basically means that the Scatter Laser is going to be wounding things like Terminators and Votan units on 4+, and probably Nurgle-like units on 5+. Anything with toughness 6 or above is going to be harder for Scatter Lasers to wound against. So overall, I think the scatter laser is relegated to light infantry now. It probably always should have been there, but, it's probably a guard equivalent killer and also, decent at killing toughness 4 models and stuff like that. As far as their special abilities go, if they control an objective at the end of your command phase, you can roll a fate dice and add it to the pool. This is exactly why people are going to take Guardians now, because of this special ability. You sit them on a home objective in the backfield, hidden away from enemy units, and you just farm command points for the entire game. Or not command points, fate dice for the entire game. This is going to be how Guardians are used. So in a way, Guardian Defenders now have a very specific role to play in an Eldar army. As far as their heavy weapon platform goes, if the Guardians are destroyed, it is too. It has 0 objective points anyway, so it's not going to be that big of a deal. It works exactly the same as it does now as far as that goes. So here's my take on Guardian Defenders. So their role now is certifiably sit on a backfield objective and farm fate dice. That is their point, that is their purpose, and that is what they're going to do every single game. Heavy weapons more or less are rebalanced. I'm not a big fan of the scatter laser nerf, but I am a fan of the star cannon and bright lance buff. The shuriken catapults are confirmed to be much worse than 9th edition, objectively speaking, but basically every weapon got a nerf in some way. So that's not that bad, I guess. I mean, if you look at Necron weapons, Necron Gauze weapons did get a buff, but they also got a drop in ballistic skill as a result. So it seems like everything that's getting a weapon buff is getting a ballistic skill buff to match, which Eldar did not get. And overall, I don't really think this is a very exciting unit, I have to say. And to be honest with you, like I said, I think any unit that just sits on a backfield objective all game and just does nothing except farm some fate dice or, farm objective points is going to be a very boring unit, but is one that is going to be needed in every game. So I do think it's going to be an auto include, but only because of that fate dice farming mechanic. Moving on to the Fire Prism, the Prism Cannon. So the Prism Cannon has 2 profiles, just like before. It has a Blast profile, which has 2d6 attacks, at Ballistic Skill 3, Strength 6, AP -1, Damage 2. I predicted it would be AP -2, but I was wrong, it's AP -1. The Focus Lances have the Linked Fire ability. They have Strength 18, which is slightly higher than I thought, -4 AP, a flat 6 damage, and 2 attacks at Ballistic Skill 3+. And basically, what the Linked Fire ability allows you to do is it allows you to draw line of sight from any other Fire Prism that you yourself have line of sight on. So this is going to be a little bit weird, right? And I'll talk about that in a second. But basically, it's an ability that allows you to draw line of sight from different angles on the battlefield. So it's not flat damage. It's just an ability that may allow you to see something that you would normally not be able to. Okay, so here's my take on the Fire Prism. So the Disperse Shot is weaker despite its slightly increased average shots, except against very large units because of its blast keyword, which is improved now. Focus Shot, in my honest opinion, has no real synergy with Fate Dice, as it has no hit or wound on 6 abilities, and its damage is a flat number that cannot be rolled for. So I think this is actually kind of a shame that they just put it as a flat damage 6, because of the fact that it would be so good to synergize this with Fate Dice. And lastly, Linked Fire is interesting, but it doesn't look to be worth the investment in 2 Fire Prisms. And again, I think that because Bright Lances can out-damage Fate Dice, they can out-damage the Fire Prism with Fate Dice, I think the Fire Prism is going to be kind of overcosted. Again, we haven't seen the points yet. If the Fire Prisms are cheap enough, I'm sure people will take them. But it just seems like if I can do the same thing but better with a Bright Lance, why wouldn't I just pick up a single Warwalker with 2 Bright Lances, right? Which is basically the same thing. And yeah, it doesn't wound as easily, but it can potentially do more damage. And again, you can use Fate Dice to kind of shore up the wound roll and the hit roll, and you can use your detachment ability to make sure that you do wound and hit. And lastly, we have the stratagem Fire and Fade. So Fire and Fade basically got a buff, believe it or not. So it is highly command point intensive. You will get less command points in 10th edition, but you can target any unit with it now, including things like Wraith Knights, it looks like. Aircraft can still not be targeted. And the unit makes a normal move, using its movement value. This is huge on fast-moving units like jet bikes and vehicles who can move up to 16 inches a turn. That's insane. That basically gives your unit an extra movement. And this is really insane and has a lot of cool applications. For example, you can use a unit of Wind Riders to get into an opponent's deployment zone turn 1. You can also do this with Shroud Runners, or you could also do this with Viper jet bikes, because it doesn't matter what you use it on. You can use it on basically anything. Now, the problem is that it costs 2 command points, and because you start at 0, there might be a chance that you're not going to be able to use this until turns 2 or 3. So that is going to be a bit rough, but if we follow the trends and the Autarch gets the ability to refund command points or make a stratagem cost 0 command points per turn, this could be a very good use of that. So basically getting a free Fire and Fade every turn because you have an Autarch on the battlefield could be worth its weight in absolute gold. So here's my take on this. So it seems better than it was before in terms of versatility, as it can now basically target anything other than aircraft. And a normal move can be quite good and get really fast units from one side of the board to the other if needed to capture objectives, to escape from enemy units, etc. However, the steep command cost and the less command points available means you will not be able to use it as often unless we can get free stratagems via the Autarch. Okay, so here's my overall thoughts. Looking at the reveal, I just thought it was okay. Looking at the changes, it reminds me a lot of the way we used to run things in 8th edition when our battle focus did not allow us to move after shooting. Strands of Fate is obviously much worse than it is now, except that now if you wanted to, you could use all of your Fate dice at once in the early stages of the game, so turns 1 and 2, and that might be a style of play that's looking pretty viable now, is Alpha Strike. The detachment rule itself is pretty good, but it's not battle focus. And I think we're going to have to rely a lot more on Ignore's line of sight weapons or transports to protect most of our vulnerable units now, as Fire and Fade will most likely be 2 command point intensive to use every single turn, except if an Autarch allows it to be free. And I also think we're going to see a lot more expendable units out there, a lot more MSU style Eldar, using the basically detachment ability to their advantage to get a hit reroll and wound reroll, and also be protected from losing too much in any one turn. So basically just keeping our units MSU and expendable so that we can trade them in as needed. I also think that a Farseer will probably still be a decent choice in the backfield for the 6s of Fate dice, which will probably be needed throughout the game to make sure that your 1s and 2s can be traded in for 6s. The Fire Prism itself seems like it'll be objectively weaker than other options, both for anti-large and anti-infantry, but we're going to have to just wait and see about its points cost first. Again, it could be pointed to the level that's, pretty decent and cost effective. And it may have some synergy with different, across the battlefield line of sight shenanigans. We're just going to have to wait and see, and I'm going to have to play test them to really see how effective they are. Because to be honest with you, on paper, they don't look that great in terms of damage. The Guardians, to be honest with you, I'm just going to be very candid here. They look boring as fuck, and are going to be basically relegated to farming Fate dice on an objective for their entire game. And funnily enough, I think because of this, they will probably be an auto-include in most builds, right? I think that is a very powerful ability to just continuously generate Fate dice throughout the game, and I think that Storm Guardians might also have that ability as well. So in conclusion, well, it wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but I'm already thinking of quite a few combinations and synergies that would be extremely effective. Single model units, obviously, with anti-large weapons are going to be fantastic with a free reroll to hit and wound on top of the Fate dice, which can manipulate the damage roll on top of it. And also, even though they haven't shown Wraith units with a Farseer are going to be nasty as fuck. Apparently, because, everything in the game is getting tougher, Wraithguard will probably still be toughness 6, I'm guessing, and because of that, most weapons are going to wound them on 5+. With that -1 to wound, most weapons in the game are going to start wounding them on 6+. And this can be used multiple times, it looks like. So if you have multiple units of Wraithguard, you can have a Farseer in each one of them, and you can roll Fortune on each squad separately. It's no longer limited to 1 psychic power per turn. And that's pretty awesome. That means that most likely we're going to see a resurgence of Wraith units in an army, if not in mass, then definitely in squads of, 5 or 10. And this can definitely give any Eldar player good midfield presence that doesn't have to worry too much about being shot at, unlike the rest of our army. And again, it's not all that bad. I just think that our aspects are going to have to really require transports if they do want to be fielded. Like if we want to field Dire Avengers or something like that, we're definitely going to need to put them in a transport. or find another way to get them out of harm's way, like put them in reserve and, things like this. So what I want to do is over the next couple weeks, I want to kind of do some practice games with people in my group, see if anyone's interested in little 500-point battles or something like that using the new rules or what we know. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, who knows? I don't exactly know many people who would be keen to just, kind of play without the full set of rules in front of them. But we'll see. I have a lot of cool guys in my gaming group that'll probably be down. And I definitely want to share the results with you guys so that you guys kind of have a better idea of how Eldar are going to work in 10th edition. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today. Peace out. See you guys later. And thank you once again to all my patrons who've supported the channel over the last months. Your help is greatly appreciated. And if anybody wants to become a patron or a supporter of the channel, I'll leave my links in the description for those of you who want to join. And thank you so much to those who have. All right, everybody. So without further ado, peace out. Until next time. I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a good one, everybody. See you later.